Welcome back to another episode of Christian Natural Health. Today I'm going to be talking about SIBO and why it recurs. SIBO is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, and it's fundamentally different than a pathogen in the gut. Rather, it's a relatively benign bacteria, but it's in excessive amounts and in the wrong place. But how does it get there, and why is it so notoriously difficult to get rid of once it does? There are three types of SIBO, at least that we know how to measure now, defined by the type of gas that they overproduce: hydrogen, methane, and hydrogen sulfide. The bacteria that produce these all live in a symbiotic environment with one another, and they should be in the colon primarily, not in the small intestine. The hydrogen producers include species in the Bacteroides and the Firmicutes phyla and more in the latter. These organisms break complex carbohydrates down into hydrogen, CO2, and short-chain fatty acids, which are the food for the colon. Hydrogen producers are upstream of the other two, as both the methane and the hydrogen sulfide producers consume the hydrogen. Their presence also supports the hydrogen producers too, since excessive amounts of hydrogen gas, aside from the discomfort this might produce in the host, produces a feedback suppression mechanism and actually decreases their own fermentation efficiency. This means less short chain fatty acids, among other things. So the hydrogen consumers, the bacteria that consume the hydrogen fall into three categories, and only one of those three is not associated with SIBO. These species compete with one another for the same food source. Which one wins depends upon the environment in the gut. The one hydrogen sink not associated with a type of SIBO are the acetogens, primarily Blautia hydrogenotrophica. See, I don't know if I pronounced that right. These consume hydrogen and CO2 and produce acetate, which is itself a useful short chain fatty acid, and water. Methanogens are bacteria that consume hydrogen and CO2 and produce methane gas, CH4, and water. These are mostly the organism Methanobrevibacter smithii. CH4 methane isn't toxic, but it does slow bowel transit. So those with the methane type of SIBO tend toward constipation. Unfortunately, methanogens outcompete acetogens for hydrogen if they're present. They just have a higher affinity for it. Sulfate-reducing bacteria are mostly the organism D. sulfovibrio piger. I don't know if I did that one right either. These combine hydrogen with sulfate, which is SO4. That's the form that's often found in the sulfur-containing foods. And they reduce the latter to hydrogen sulfide gas and water. Hydrogen sulfide is the most problematic product in excess. Specifically, hydrogen sulfide can inhibit butyrate oxidation, preventing the colonocytes from using butyrate for repair, mucus production, and serotonin production to regulate motility, but only at high levels. In lower concentrations, hydrogen sulfide does not interfere with butyrate utilization. Hydrogen sulfide is also toxic to mitochondrial complex 4 in the electron transport chain, leading to reduced ATP production, which will affect the mitochondria in the colon, since those are the cells that would be exposed. It's not all bad, though. At lower levels, hydrogen sulfide has the exact opposite effect, acting as a mitochondrial electron donor. In other words, hydrogen sulfide is hormetic. The dose makes the poison, like with everything else. The sulfur-reducing bacteria also happen to outcompete the methanogens for hydrogen, provided there's enough sulfur to go around to feed them. Interestingly, the sulfur-reducing bacteria don't outcompete with the acetogens, though. Probably good, so that we have a checks and balances situation going on in the gut rather than one dominant kingpin. Dr. Rudolf Virchow, the father of modern pathology, reportedly said, "If I could live my life over again, I would devote it to proving that germs seek their natural habitat, diseased tissue, rather than being the cause of dead tissue." In other words, mosquitoes seek the stagnant water, but do not cause the pool to become stagnant. While it might still be appropriate to treat SIBO with antimicrobials, herbal or antibiotic, we have to also keep in mind the environment that allowed them to thrive in the first place. Dr. William Davis's approach in supergut involves fermenting specific organisms, particularly Lactobacillus reuteri, which effectively outcompetes other SIBO-associated organisms in the small intestine. Many of my patients have found this to be helpful. Promotility agents are often utilized to try to prevent SIBO from crawling back up into the colon where they don't belong, from the colon into the small intestine where they don't belong also. This can be helpful if you can't clearly identify or correct the reason for the slowdown in the first place, such as hypothyroidism. High-dose progesterone can slow down bowel transit in sensitive individuals, a broad-spectrum antibiotic, a GLP-1, or any other pharmaceutical with bowel transit side effects, etc. There might be a couple other useful pieces to the puzzle beyond these two, though. Butyrate is a potential adjunct therapy for SIBO. As I mentioned previously, particularly hydrogen sulfide SIBO can interfere with butyrate utilization by the colonocytes. Supplemented butyrate would likely be subject to similar interference, but high enough supplemented doses might nevertheless overcome this. During the methane SIBO treatment, there's a risk for the population to switch from hydrogen sulfide dominance if we're not careful, particularly if the SIBO test indicated a relatively low hydrogen level, suggesting that the butyrate producers aren't terribly robust. In this situation, adding butyrate during and shortly after treatment can be helpful. In pure hydrogen sulfide, or sorry, in pure hydrogen SIBO, butyrate might be less indicated since the hydrogen producers also make butyrate. However, in SIBO test result, if the SIBO test results don't tell us anything about whether the hydrogen producers are also abundant in the colon, where the butyrate would actually be helpful. So if the hydrogen SIBO is recurrent, it might be helpful in these cases too. Another potential strategy might be to increase the one hydrogen sink that doesn't have the potential to lead to SIBO, the acetogens, which are only beneficial. Blautia, the dominant acetogen, doesn't exist as a supplement yet, but especially after SIBO treatment, we can support it indirectly by feeding it. Fortunately, of the hydrogen consumers, the acetogens are the only ones that don't have to consume hydrogen. If the hydrogen production is low, acetogens can switch to sugar fermentation just as the hydrogen producers can and simply carry on. This is challenging during SIBO treatment because the acetogens primarily consume fermentable carbs, the very thing feeding SIBO. So timing is important. We can only add in those substrates in the recovery phase. Resistant starch combined with fiber works well for this after SIBO has been eradicated. An oligosaccharide from human milk, which generally doesn't cause much gas and bloating as other carbs, also appears to increase Blautia in the presence of bifidobacillus. Bifidobacillus is necessary too, though, because Blautia actually eats a byproduct of bifidobacillus metabolism of the 2-FL, which is the type of oligosaccharide that I was referring to. The 2-FL is commercially available. Supporting bifidobacillus in general seems to be the best way to support the acetogen population at the moment, as the two are generally synergistic. If a stool culture shows low levels of bifidobacillus genus, it's important not to supplement with it, but to identify why and to address, not just to supplement with it rather, but to identify why and address that at the same time. There's usually an environmental toxin poisoning the good bacteria that will need to be addressed. Glyphosate is one I see commonly, though there are plenty of other possibilities as well. So the bottom line, if SIBO, any type, tends to recur, it's usually because the populations are shuffling from one type to another, filling in the vacancy of the local ecosystem. The question is always, why is this happening? And then to address that. So I will link in the show notes to the blog post this comes from. All of the studies are linked in there as well. I hope that was helpful to you. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next week.